do you see here?
A road.
A road. Why am I showing this as the first slide in this new section on the Republic of Rome?
Because all roads lead to Rome.
Very good, Griff. All roads lead to Rome. Where does that say? How many have heard that saying before? About half of you. Where does that saying come from? Or what does it mean? Well, hopefully we'll find out as we enter into our study of the Republic of Rome, the Roman Republic. All roads lead to Rome. The first of the great paved Roman roads was called the Via Appia. It was named after the censor. Remember that office among the Romans called censor? Appius Claudius. And it was named after him because he developed a new basis for judging a person's tax liability. That is, ownership of property. So he's kind of the one that invented property taxes. So if your parents complain about that, tell them it goes all the way back to Appius Claudius. His system opened up fresh resources of revenue for the state. And Rome used much of this money in the construction of roads. In 312 BC, the Romans constructed the first aqueduct leading into Rome. And that was called the Aqua Appia. So, it's called Via Appia, the Appian Way, after Appius Claudius, who came up with property taxes, which paid for roads. And here is a map that shows the roads. And you can see here's Rome, and the roads that go out from Rome, and the roads go all over the Roman Empire. And then here's a picture of one of the aqueducts, the Aqua Appia, again paid for from property taxes. So it was a way to bring water down from the mountains down to the city. And some places had to go over deep ravines, and so had to build all of this in order to support the waterway, for the water to flow on down. Here's another picture of a different place of an aqueduct from a different angle. This is, of course, over more level land. And here it is right inside of the city, bringing water in from the mountains. Fresh water for the Romans. Now, as we think about the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic we're looking at now, before it becomes an empire, we remember the figure that Daniel described to us in the book of Daniel of the statue that was in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember this? And the different parts represented different empires that would arise. First, there was the Babylonian. We looked at that. The Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, brought about by Alexander the Great, and now we're in Rome. As we are in Rome, we're going to begin with Rome as a republic, and eventually it will become an empire. And that is then the last empire, which is destroyed by the kingdom of God or by Christ himself. Now, as we think about Rome at these early stages of the Republic, we know that it is a culmination of these ancient civilizations, but they are in the depths of spiritual darkness. They have not learned from the previous civilizations. They've not been exposed to God, the one true God in Israel, and so they are living in spiritual darkness. But eventually, Rome would become the cradle of Christianity. So it's quite a transition that we're going to see as we study Rome, that it goes from a place that was characterized by spiritual darkness to being the place in which Christianity grows and prospers. We find the continued influence of Rome. Rome, the city, is going to have an influence over much of the world. Rome, the republic, The influence of the Republic idea in Rome would reach down into our own country. Rome, the empire, set a standard that has not been matched for empires before this or after. We have Rome, the culture. Many aspects of Roman culture that, again, we find in influencing people down to the present day. And then we have Rome, the church that was in Rome, and the influence that has had. That's going to take up a lot of our study throughout the rest of the year, looking at the church of Rome. All right, so we want to look at the beginning of Roman civilization by looking at the geographic features of Italy. Well, whenever you look at any place that people settle, there are usually geographic features, so some aspects of the topography which affects people living there, which is the reason why people are living there. Now, as we look at Italy, and of course Italy is easily recognizable because of its boot-like shape. Everyone can probably recognize Italy because of that. The soil of Italy and the climate of Italy were suitable for farming. So being in the Mediterranean Sea, you get the warm breezes off the Mediterranean. You have warm weather for most of the year. So it's very conducive to farming. And so that's what people did throughout Italy. There's another geographic feature that has a big part to play, and that is that there is a range of mountains that runs right down the middle of the boot, called the Apennine Mountains, or Apennines, some might say. And then, of course, the other geographical feature is the Mediterranean Sea itself that is surrounding the boot, although these are separate seas here, but it's all part of the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean itself comes from the Latin, the language of Rome. Medi in Mediterranean means middle. Terra, Terranean, means land. Thus, the word Mediterranean means sea in the middle of the land. Later called by the Romans Mare Nostrum, our sea. They looked at the Mediterranean as belonging to them. Now, when we think about the early inhabitants of Italy, we could talk about a lot of different people. This map shows a number of the different people that populated the boot of Italy, but we want to focus in on just a few of them. First of all, there were the Latins. You can see that they're designated as living in this area, the Latins. They were followed by Phoenicians coming in and establishing colonies on Sicily. Here they're called Sicilians, but it was Phoenicians that came in. Remember the Phoenicians from over on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea also established a colony at Carthage, which would be a little further down this way. And the Phoenicians established settlements here along the coast of Africa, and so they have a big role to play in relationship to the development of Italy and Rome. We're going to see they're going to have a huge part to play with Rome. We have Greeks coming into Rome from Greece and coming into southern Italy. You know, it was not too far away. They're looking for land to cultivate, places where they can raise cattle. And so Greeks came into there. In fact, they referred to their land as the land of cattle. Because remember, in Greece, it's really rocky terrain, so this was a much better area on which to raise cattle. Well, they called it land of cattle, and that is, in their language, Vitalia. Vitalia eventually led to Italy, Vitalia, Italy. So the name Italy comes from the Greek settlers, meaning land of cattle. And then we have the Etruscans, who are designated in this area, forming in Italy and coming into prominence in Italy. And they established one of Italy's earliest civilizations along the west coast. Now, the Etruscans, we want to spend just a few minutes at least talking about them. They were an important people in the history of Rome, of Italy. They were originally from Africa, and they were a seafaring people. Although most Greek and Roman historians indicate that their origin was all the way over in Asia Minor in a place called Lydia. So it may be that they were in Asia Minor, traveled over here to Africa, and then eventually came up here into Italy. It may be that they were, if not Phoenician, at least related. It would appear from the description of them as being a short black race who initially populated France and Germany, that they were descendants of Ham. So they were dark-skinned people. They were a formidable foe on land. They had a secret weapon, which enabled them to defeat all other peoples with whom they came in contact. What do you suppose their secret weapon was? What would be a good weapon that would help you defeat everybody that you fought against? Back in ancient times. Don't say a howitzer or something. We're talking about ancient times.
Sword.
A sword. Maybe they had good swords. Any other ideas? What would be a good weapon, secret weapon? You're going to be surprised. Because it wasn't a sword, it wasn't a spear, it wasn't chariots, it was shoes. They developed sturdy leather shoes. Other people didn't have sturdy leather shoes. So how did that help them in battle? Well, certainly if you don't have shoes at all, it's pretty hard to fight. You know, you're out there stepping on rocks and stuff, stepping on branches. And if your shoes aren't sturdy, you know, you can feel the rocks through the bottom even. And you might lose a shoe. So their secret weapon was good shoes. And, you know, many people since have recognized that if you're going to have a successful army, you've got to have good footwear. So even, you know, you look at the more modern times, the United States Army, different armies around the world, make sure that they've got good footwear. Through most of the 6th century BC, the Etruscans and the allies that they had, the different cities that they settled, constituted the strongest political force in Italy. They had a well-organized army, they had a famous cavalry, and a powerful navy that for a time ruled what is still called the Etruscan Sea. No, well, the word we use is not Etruscan, it's Tyrrhene. And so this area is called the Tyrrhene Sea, which is the word for Etruscan. Greeks called them Tyrrhenians. That's where the name Tyrrhene Sea comes from. And that's the water west of the Italian peninsula, the Tyrrhenian Sea. Now there's an interesting feature about their writing. They wrote in the same way that an ox plowed. So normally we talk about writing and we write from left to right, like this, right? And we come to the end, we start back here to the left again. And which way do the Hebrews write? Right to left. They stop, come back, right to left again. The Etruscans did it this way. They would start out one direction, and when they got to the end, instead of starting over again, they would turn around and come back. And they come around like that. Just like if you're plowing a field, you turn, go back the next row. So some of the lines would be written what we would consider front ways, and the next line would be backwards. So interesting way of writing. I guess would that save time having to pick up your pen going all the way back to the beginning? Maybe some of you would like to try that. Just don't try it on papers you give me. Okay? I don't want to try to decipher that, but it might be a fun thing for you to do to the amusement of your friends and family. The religion was involved around the worship of 12 great gods, some of whom kept hordes of winged demons. It included the sacrifice of sheep, bulls, and men. So they had human sacrifice. An author wrote this: human victims were slaughtered or buried alive at the funerals of the great. Another person said, the Etruscan appears to have believed that for every enemy slain, he could secure the release of a soul from hell. So unlike in later times when giving money would get people out of purgatory, the Etruscans believed that if they killed an enemy, that would get one of their family out of hell. Interesting perspective. For a century, the Roman nation was ruled and formed by Etruscan civilization and power. So that's why we have to understand a little bit about the Etruscans. They are the greatest civilization leading up to the Roman civilization that will come into play in Italy. All right, so let's talk about the founding of Rome. Let's see. I think I have that on here again. Oh, there's the Tyrrhenian City. Okay, the founding of Rome. It's on the banks of the Tiber River. You see in this drawing the river going through here. Of course, that's normally you want to build a town near a river because of the water supply. And there were 7 Latin villages that were built there. Remember the Latins we talked about previously. 7 hills, 7 villages built on those hills. And it made up the tribes of the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans. So 3 different groups of people are coming together there. And it formed what's called the League of the 7 Hills. That's the beginning of Rome. It's the 7 hills, 7 villages that are bound together, and that's the beginning of the city of Rome. Now, the legend is a little more interesting than that. The legend is that there were 2 boys, Romulus and Remus, who were abandoned by their uncle. Their uncle took them out to die, left them on a hillside. A she-wolf found them and took them as her cubs and nursed them so that they eventually grew up. And at some point, they began to argue over who would be in charge of this area, and Romulus killed Remus. And so he built the city, and it's named after him, Rome, named after Romulus. That's the story. And you see statues, figures of the wolf nursing the 2 boys as part of the legend that was Romulus and Remus. I suppose there have been many times in history, maybe when a brother has killed a brother, but you can't help but thinking of the first time we see that in the Bible, right? What brother killed his own brother? Right, Cain killed Abel. So whether that story came down through history and it was adopted here, or whether this really happened, it's really hard to say. Now let's look at society and government, early Roman society and government. The society of the Romans was made up of the basic unit of family. So if you boil it down, what is it that holds Rome together? It would be family. And as you think about the family, of course you have to have a head of the family, and that would be the father, or the Latin is pater. The father was the sole authority in each family. I'm going to read a quotation here from Will Durant in his book, Caesar and Christ. He says, he alone of the family had any rights before the law in the early republic. He alone could buy, hold, or sell property or make contracts. Even his wife's dowry in this period belonged to him. If his wife was accused of a crime, she was committed to him for judgment and punishment. He could condemn her to death for infidelity or for stealing the keys to his wine. Over his children, he had the power of life, death, and sale into slavery. All that the son acquired became legally his father's property, nor could he marry without his father's consent. A married daughter remained under her father's power unless he allowed her to marry cum manu, that is, gave her into the hand or power of her husband. Over his slaves, he had unlimited authority. These and his wife and children were mancipia to him, literally taken in hand. And no matter what their age or status, they remained in his power until he chose to emancipate them, to let them out of hand. These rights of the pater familias were checked to some degree by custom, public opinion, the clan council, and praetorian law. Otherwise, they lasted to his death and could not be ended by his insanity or even by his own choice. Their effect was to cement the unity of the family as the basis of Roman morals and government, and to establish a discipline that hardened the Roman character into stoic strength. They were harsher in the letter than in practice. The most extreme of them were seldom used, the rest seldom abused. So you can tell from that, the father is everything. He has total control in his family. He has the power of life and of death, of punishment, slavery in the family. He can do no wrong. Well, the families were strong, and it became one of the foundations of Rome's greatness. Now, when you have a number of families together from a common ancestor, they form what's called a clan. You've probably heard that word before. It refers to families that have a common ancestor. That's a clan. We might call today an extended family. And when you have a number of clans together, that's what forms a tribe. So if you're looking at smaller to greater, you have a family unit, then you have the clan, which is a number of families, and then you have the tribe, which is a number of clans. Seem logical? Any question? There were two social classes in the Roman Republic. First, the patricians. The patricians were wealthy and aristocratic. And I want you to remember these two classes. These are important words as we understand the Roman Republic. The patricians were wealthy. And then the other class were called the plebeians. Some say plebeians. Plebeians were the common people. These are the farmers, the peasants, and even freed slaves would be considered plebeians. They could not hold public office. They were not allowed to vote on laws. So Rome, in these early stages, was run entirely by the patricians. But by 200 BC, they had most of the same rights as the patricians. So over time, they gained more and more rights until finally they were on an equal standing with the patricians. Now, as it breaks down, as you look about the social classes, usually develops into a pyramid with the smaller amount on top having the most power. And so we see that we have the patricians who have the power in Rome, the plebeians, and then below them were the slaves and the freedmen. People who had been slaves that were free. So this is essentially upper class, middle class, and lower class. Questions? All right, one last thing. Let's look at the government in this early time. Early on, they had a monarchy, which means what?
Rule by one.
Rule by one, right. So we usually associate that with a king. So one person is ruling. And he had an authority called the imperium, or the authority that he had was called imperium. Now, this is the beginning of the idea of authority and rule in Rome and other places as well. Can you think of any words that sound like they may have come from this original word, imperium?
Imperial.
Imperial. Anything else? How about if you change the I to an E?
Empire.
Empire. And eventually the person who holds the imperium would be called the emperor or emperor. You see? That's the origin of the word, is under the monarchy and the authority of the imperium. The symbol of this authority was a bundle of rods enclosing an axe called the fasces. This is what it looked like. So you have rods strapped together and an axe. Now, how would this symbolize authority? What do you think? Let's start with the axe. How would the axe symbolize authority?
Punishment.
Punishment, especially execution, right? So the axe is what you would use to chop off someone's head. And so the person who had the imperium, the fasces indicated imperium, meant that they had the authority to execute. What about the rods? What do you think they might be used for? Have your parents ever used a rod?
Showing dominance.
Yeah, dominance in form of what?
Punishment.
Punishment. Yeah. So here we have capital punishment, and here's just regular corporal punishment. The rods are used to beat someone. I hadn't thought much about this until recently in looking at Acts 16 when the Apostle Paul goes to the city of Philippi. Do you remember this? He and Silas were preaching, and there was a demon-possessed girl following around, telling people that they were messengers of the Most High God, and they have a way of salvation. And finally, Paul has had enough, and he turns around and casts the demons out of her, which upset her owners. And they got the city council involved, and so they brought them in, and they beat them with rods. Philippi was a little Rome. They had to operate just like Rome, and so they probably had the same thing. Probably had the fasces there. Took one of those rods and beat Paul and Silas, and of course threw them in jail. And hopefully you know what happened to them at midnight that night. But that's a form of authority, and it has influenced us to this day. So that on our dime, at least it used to be, it may not be anymore. Some of the older dimes, at least, you'll see the imperium, or maybe the fasces, here on the dime. Now, our particular version has branches with leaves growing out of it. I'm not sure of the symbolism that's there. Maybe it shows that there's life. I don't know. So that is the government then of the early Roman period. The Etruscans and Latins are there. We have the city of Rome founded. We have a monarchy with the authority called the imperium, the symbol of that being the fasces. All right, do you have any questions about what we've talked about concerning these early days of Rome? All right, no questions, then I'll let you begin working on your assignment for tomorrow. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing I wanted to do. Turn to page 77 in your books. You're going to be reading this section, and I think it's a good idea for us to look over it first beforehand, because otherwise I think it'll be very confusing for you. So let's look at the chart on page 77. This is a chart showing the government of the early Roman Republic. Once we get past monarchy, then what was it like and how does it develop? So on top, and you see the arrows show the flow of political power. So where does all political power originate?
The Senate.
The Senate, right. And notice what it says about the Senate. Now, from the Senate, we have coming two different pairs. On the left-hand side, we see that out of the Senate come what are called two censors. They are chosen from the Senate membership. They serve for 18 months. They are the ones that drew up official lists determining taxation, military service, and voting eligibility. So they handle particular aspects related to the governing of Rome. They're called censors. Now, if you look on the other side, on the right-hand side, you see that also from the Senate come two consuls. And they serve for 1 year, less than the censors. They are the ones that held the imperium. They carried out laws and commanded the army. So the consuls provided the function of the executive branch of the government for the early Roman Republic. The Senate, of course, which is legislative, somewhat executive, but they gave some of the executive power to the consuls and some of it to the censors. Now we see next that from the censors, first there came what's called the tribal assembly. This was a popular assembly. The members were chosen from the territorial districts called tribute. They were elected, they elected some government officials. So eventually what happened is that the plebeians began to call for more participation of themselves in the government, and so they eventually were able to have this tribal assembly. And we'll see how that develops. Let's go next to the other group that comes out of the Senate, and that's the Assembly of Centuries. This is a popular assembly, again, from the common people. The members were organized by social class. And they voted by group, each group having one vote, and they elected some government officials. So with the tribal assembly and the Assembly of Centuries, we have more involvement on the one hand from the different tribes outside the city, the other hand from groups of 100 in Rome, and these two assemblies then begin to acquire some more political power. Now, from the tribal assembly and the Assembly of Centuries, you see that there are 10 tribunes selected by these two assemblies. They serve for 1 year. Now, what function do they have? Well, they can veto decisions by the Senate or the consuls. So if the consuls want to do something and the people in the tribal assembly and the Assembly of Centuries don't think that's good for them, then the tribunes can veto it. They can say, no, that's not going to happen. If the Senate decides to do something and the tribunes think that that's not a good idea, they can veto it. They can say no, and they have that power to veto it. Now, that doesn't happen all at once. These are things that develop slowly. But hopefully by me talking through this chart, you're able to understand it a little bit better than just by looking at it. You agree? I feel like you got a kind of a handle on what this chart is communicating. Okay. Look over it again. Don't just think, okay, no, that's done, so I don't have to look at that again. No, look at it again and review it in your mind to see the relationship between these two different groups. And then for tomorrow, I want you to read and take notes on your outline from pages 77 to 79 and do the questions on page 79 on the same paper that you did page 76 for today. Any questions? All right, you have about 5 minutes. You can get started on that.